Hello everybody, you have tuned in to Eric Jose on Making a Murderer on YouTube. I cover virtually any aspect of making a murderer. I go over the evidence, the documents, the photos. So if you like, stay tuned, and in the future I'll have many more videos besides the one you're about to see. Hello everybody, how are you today? We are here today to talk a little bit about the oral arguments at the 7th Circuit Court for the Banc review. I'm going to break this up into multiple videos because obviously they spoke for about an hour. It's a lot of material there, so I'm going to start at the beginning. At the beginning, we have Luke Berg for the state of Wisconsin, and we have Judge Williams, who's basically asking him about the fact that so many, reassurances or false promises were given to Brendan, and why he thinks that they're not significant. So I'm going to go ahead and play the clip now where we have the judges asking him to explain why the numerous and repetitious reassurances were not significant to this case or to the voluntariness of this confession. So we'll play that clip now.
And here, the totality of circumstances show he was told at least 28 times during the interview that everything was okay, that they already knew the truth, and it wasn't his fault. 28 times.
They also took numerous precautions to protect against Dassey misunderstanding anything they said.
Could you tell us what precautions they took?
Absolutely. They began the very first interview by telling Dassey, you can leave at any time, and you don't have to answer any of our questions. They repeated that.
Could I just ask, and because you mentioned the first interview, when we think of the totality of his interactions with the police officers, he sees these same officers on a couple of occasions, twice, and I believe it's the February 27th interview, then the March 1st interview. Shouldn't we evaluate his interactions with them on the basis of all of that, if we're really doing the totality?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that's why I'm recounting some of the things.
So if Officer Fassender makes a promise of lenience in even one of the earlier ones, that's a problem.
I think that would be relevant, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so then in that February 27th, they actually said they were not acting as officers, but instead as fathers. So doesn't that confuse their roles and imply leniency to an intellectually or emotionally limited juvenile?
No.
Why not?
As I said, they warned Dassey he can leave at any time, and anything he said can be used against him. They repeated that warning throughout. At the end of that first interview, after making multiple...
So the fact that they said that they were acting as if they were his fathers, that doesn't have any bearing on it.
I think it's a factor, certainly.
So, as I listen to Luke Berg's argument there, it occurs to me that he's basically arguing that as long as you say a Miranda warning a handful of times and tell the person being interrogated that they can leave anytime they want a couple of times throughout the interview, that's completely, equal to repeatedly 28 times telling the suspect that they think he's fine. He doesn't have anything to worry about. Unbelievable. Now, I understand that this is, most likely common, practices for the courts. That this is the way that they analyze things, and that they're just accustomed to the way that the law has played out over time, that they don't give considerable weight to multiple vague assurances. So they basically focus on whether or not the Miranda warning and that sort of stuff was given, and as long as it was, then any amount of other assurances, reassurances, vague promises, you're basically unlimited. You could do that all day long, so long as you say a couple times a Miranda warning, basically. So I just see that as a problem, particularly moving forward in the future with juveniles, and I do really seriously hope that it gets addressed. Now we're going to talk about the two things that Luke Berg offered as facts that Brendan offered up to the investigators without them having to feed it to him. Now, the fact that Luke Berg, number one, is pointing out 2 incidents where Brendan wasn't fed the fact, but think about that for a second. That means he's acquiescing, in a sense, to the fact that pretty much the other 98% of the facts were fed to him. But the 2 facts that he chooses are completely off to me. 2 things that cannot be corroborated. In fact, one that is provably false. And this is what the state is clinging to in this case.
I'll give you 2 very important details. 2 details that he provided that weren't even suggested by the question that was asked of him. So early on, Dassey said that Avery put Teresa in the back of the truck. They asked him, was she dead? And he said, yes. And they said, Dassey, how do you know that? At that point, he realizes that he's been caught in a lie. And quite logically, but unexpectedly, he says, well, I was biking and I could hear it. They're like, what? Hear what? Screaming.
But there had been huge publicity about this case.
There wasn't publicity about her screaming, help me.
He knows that she's dead, right? As of the time of these 2 or 3 interviews. Everybody in the United States knows that she's dead by the time of these interviews.
Yes, that's true.
Right?
But he provided a lot of detail that he could not possibly have gotten from anywhere. I think the most telling examples are his memories of Teresa. He remembers her screaming, help me, and how she looked, naked and chained up to the bed. He remembered her crying. But they feed him
that. I mean, that's not something that initially... In fact, there are contradictions in his accounts. The contradictions are rife.
They didn't feed him the fact that she was handcuffed to the bed. That was another...
But there's no evidence that she was either. They
found handcuffs in the bedroom.
So here we are. The court is asking Luke Berg, what facts did Brendan offer on his own without the facts being fed to him? And what does Luke Berg offer? I mean, are you kidding me? Okay, she was screaming because he heard her screaming, help me? Are you kidding, Luke? Anybody in any kind of duress, help me is such a default phrase. I mean, so many people would say that if they were being victimized. I mean, it isn't hard for somebody who doesn't know what's going, didn't know and was just guessing at all this stuff to just say, yeah, oh, she was saying help me, because it just seems logical that that's what somebody in that situation would say. But add to the fact that there's no corroboration of this. None. All you have is the fact that Brendan said it happened. So there's no real way to prove that Brendan's even being truthful, that it even happened, because you can't corroborate it. Now, let's move on to fact 2, or point 2 of Luke Berg. That the officers didn't feed him the information about the handcuffs. Yeah, okay. Now you're relying on a fact, Luke Berg, that is provably false. There's no way that those handcuffs were used in any way to tie her up to that bed. Somebody thrashing for their life with handcuffs, the handcuffs would have marred up that wooden bedpost severely. You can't even... I mean, this isn't even questionable. This is ridiculous. He just offered up 2 points that are ridiculous. One of them is actually provably false. This next clip, we hear Luke Berg saying a few things about Brendan that I think are kind of ridiculous, really. The first thing he says is he says that most people in Brendan Dassey's position, if they saw what he saw, wouldn't have taken part in it, or wouldn't have gotten involved in it. Well, that's the whole point we're trying to make, is that it doesn't appear that Brendan Dassey was involved in it. He's guessing. All the time throughout this interrogation, he's guessing. It's obvious he's guessing. And like I said, there's no real corroborating facts that come out of this that weren't fed to him. That's a problem. But then he goes on to say that Brendan Dassey doesn't understand how horrific it is to rape someone, or whatever, basically. Now, I've gone over this, interview so much. I've gone over these tapes so many times. I'm reminded of the time when they're getting him to say he went into Steven's trailer, getting him to say he walked down the hall, getting him to talk about what he talked with Steven, about with Steven or whatever. And so he's making things up or whatever. And at one point they say, did he ask you if you wanted to, do something or whatever? And so he's like, oh yeah, he told me if I wanted to get some or whatever. And I said, no, because I'm not grown yet and I can't have children. Okay. With a quote like that, that shows the type of thinking, the way that Brendan thinks. And I assure you, he thinks that rape is a horrific thing.
Most people who commit murder, dismemberment, and destruction of a corpse don't think they're just going to go back to school and turn in their 6th period project.
Most people, if they saw what Dassey saw, wouldn't have participated.
Well, but I'm just saying, doesn't that tell you that he is just a person who doesn't get it? They told him, if you talk to us, everything is going to be fine. We have your back. We're your father. Promises are made.
I think those statements show, at most, that Dassey doesn't understand how awful it is to rape and murder someone.
Now, keep in mind here, we're talking about Brendan Dassey. Okay? Brendan Dassey, who never had any contact with police or law enforcement prior to the Teresa Halbach case. He was not in any trouble. He was, he wasn't even really much of a problem at school. I mean, he was in special ed classes, but it wasn't like he was, causing all kinds of trouble at school either. And the reports of him and his demeanor in prison, I am not kidding you. He is described as exceedingly benign, or Brendan would not hurt a fly. He's just not wired that way. He just can't do it. It's I don't know. It seems obvious to me, and I think it's obvious to a lot of people when they watch Brendan. But yeah, he's the type of kid who just couldn't hurt a fly. The other thing that I still maintain, and maintain vigorously, is how can you deem a confession voluntary if all of the facts, or 90% of the facts, 95% of the facts, are fed to the suspect? How is that voluntary? Anyways, the main reason for doing this video was to point out the 2 facts that Luke Berg offered as facts that Brendan offered without being fed those facts. Well, as it turns out, one of them can't be proven if it's even true, and the other one is provably false. And this is what the state is clinging to. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe, and we'll see you guys.